Hey everybody, how's it going? I wanted to talk to you a little bit about working with dates in R because, well, I was just working with them and they can be tricky, and I thought that maybe it would be good for us to have a little tutorial of how we're going to work with these things. So, why do we worry about dates in R? Why is it a big deal? Yeah, it's a big deal. It's kind of a pain. Usually, or often anyway, Excel and R do not handle dates properly, or they don't handle them in the way that you expect them to. So let me show you an example of what I'm talking about here. Okay, so I want to give you an example of what can go wrong when R doesn't handle your dates properly. And so what I've got is a data file that has some zooplankton data, and I've done a lot of programming here, which we don't need to talk about now, but ultimately I have summarized this to give us the total zooplankton in numbers per liter on each date. And if you look here, at first glance, everything seems to be fine. These dates look valid. The dates are matched up with the proper value for total zooplankton, and that's all true. But here's one problem. If you look at this, you see that the dates are not in chronological order. And that suggests that R is not really treating them as dates, and that could cause us a problem later. And so to show you and to prove this to you, what I want to do is I want to look at this variable called sample underscore date. Okay, that's the variable or the vector that holds the dates in this data frame. And you might remember from your R programming that every vector, every variable has a class. It's the type of data that is held in that vector. And so for this vector, obviously we want that to be date. We want the class to be the date type because these are date data. And then, for example, in total zo, that's a number. So we want that to be in a number format, not a date format. And again, that is called the class in R. And so to figure out what the class is for a given variable, we use the statement class. And then we put in the variable of interest. Now, so I want to look at what class total zo is, because that's just a regular number. And remember that total zo is a vector that is in a data frame called zo.dat large 2. So this is a data frame that holds several variables and holds our data. And in this data frame, we've got two vectors, sample date, which holds the date, and total zo, which holds the number of zooplankton. All right. And so I'm going to go zo.dat large 2 $. So that's telling me look in that data frame that's named zo.dat large 2 and pull out the vector named total underscore zo. So this is saying go to this data frame, find this vector, and tell me what the class is. So what type of vector, what type of variable is total zo? I hit return, and you see it's numeric. Wonderful. And R is pretty good at guessing what is the proper class. But let's do the same thing. So I'm going to go up arrow to pull back that last statement, and I'm going to change it. And now we're going to look at the vector called sample date. Again, remember your R programming. The data frame is named zo.dat large 2, and then the vector is named sample date. So go to this data frame, pull out this vector, and tell me what is the class for this vector. And when I do that, you see it's factor. It's not date. And so when R read this in originally from Excel, it was guessing what class do I make each one of these vectors, and it guessed wrong for this one. It should have guessed date, but it doesn't. That's the whole point of this entire video that I'm showing you, is that if you don't do this right, R guesses wrong, and it calls it a factor. That's why it doesn't treat it properly. That's why these dates are not in chronological order because it doesn't see them as dates. That might cause a problem later. Okay, well, we can change things and make them dates. We can tell R, hey, treat this as a date. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to make a new variable in this data frame. So the data frame is called zo.dat large2, and I'm going to create a new vector that I'm going to call new date. All right? Well, what's new date going to be? This is a new vector, and it's going to hold, I'm going to take the data that's in sample date and just convert it to the date class. That should work, right? So I'm going to go as date. Note the D is capitalized here. And then I'm going to refer back to the vector that holds the dates, the bad dates. Zo.large. Zo.dat.large.2 sample underscore date. So again, what does this command say? It says go to the data frame named zo.large2. Find a vector called sample date. Convert all the values in this vector to dates. We know they're not dates right now. They're treated as factors. We just looked that up. We're going to convert them to dates, and then we're going to store them in a new variable called new date, which is in the same data frame. Return. All right. So now let's look at that data frame, which should have 3 vectors in it now. It should have the original 2, which are sample date and total zo, and then this new one, which is new date. And so I'm going to go zo.dat.large2, and here I have 3 vectors. You see the original ones. And here's new date, where we're just taking what was in sample date, and now we converted it to the date class. That should work, right? But it didn't. Here's the problem. This again proves that R is not treating that properly. See, it looks like a date to us here in the US, 1/10/2016, but when you convert that to a date, it's saying year 1, you know, month 10, date 20. It's very confused. All right? That underscores the problem with reading dates into R. If they're not read in properly, the data, R is getting confused and it's gobbledygook, and that'll be a problem later. Again, if we look at the class of this new variable, zo.dat.large.2 $new date. So what kind of variable is this new date? It is a date variable. It has the proper class. Of course it does. We made it the proper class up here. But it's based upon this vector that it thinks is a factor, and it just gets confused. Bottom line, this is why I created this video, because if you don't format the date properly in Excel, then R doesn't read it in properly, then R gets confused and it does crazy things like this, which can be a pain later on in your analysis. So now let's talk about how we're going to get these dates into R so that R handles them properly. So you kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about there. Let's first talk about dates in Excel. Now, I already have another video talking about dates and times in Excel and how Excel handles those and how you can add and subtract them. You should really take a look at that because that's kind of a different subject from this one, but it's also very important. Now, when we import the dates from Excel into R, that adds another layer of complexity and another series of things that can go wrong. And so that's what we're going to deal with in this video. So I'm going to show you a method that works for me, and it seems to work consistently. But understand, there's more than one way to skin a catfish. This is not the only way, and it may not even be the best way, but it's my way, and I think it works all the time. So let's take a look. The first thing is we have to worry about the date format in Excel. Um, and so before we get to R, we have to get things right in Excel. If we set things up in Excel, then that makes things a lot easier to work with in R. Now, there are many ways you can write a date, but the best, I think, is something called ISO 8601. This is an international standard that people came up with for writing dates. So, trying to get everybody to write dates in the same way. It's, similar to the metric system, a very simple, consistent way of writing things. And the format that we're going to use goes year, then month, then day. And the year is in 4 digits. And then the year and the month and day are separated by dashes, not by slashes. So this is different than the way we write this here in the United States. We often go, month, day, year, or sometimes day, month, year, and we have slashes, and there's all kinds of different ways. But this is the format that we're going to work with. And one of the reasons is this is one of the formats that R easily recognizes. So if we get into the habit of putting our dates in this format, it's going to help us out in the long run. Now, here's the problem. It's not easy to find how to do this in Excel until you know where to look. So let's look. I'm going to show you how to apply the proper format in Excel. Okay, here is my original data file. This is that zooplankton data that I was showing you earlier. And if you look in the very first column, we have sample underscore date, which was that vector that was giving us trouble earlier. And you see we've got a bunch of dates in here. But again, we need to format this properly so that R understands it. And we want to format it with the year first, then the month, then the day. So depending upon your version of Excel, it's in different places, but we're going to find where the formatting is. And we'll look at number formats. And right now, it is set to a date format, but it's in, again, a typical way we do it here in the United States, and this format is not going to work. So there's a couple ways we can switch it to the format we want. One is to create a custom format, and we're going to go ahead and choose custom, and we're going to come up here and we're going to make our own, which is going to be YYYY-MM-DD. And then we're going to go ahead and hit OK, and you see that the one cell that was selected did change to the proper format. And so if we wanted to do that, we just select this whole column and apply that format. And so that's one way of doing it. Now I'm going to Control Z to go revert that back. And I'm going to show you a different way. I'm going to go back to the number formats. And when I choose date over here as a category, then down here you've got the locale, which for me, of course, is the United States. Well, one thing I want to note, if you got the United States, if you scroll through all the formats, you don't see that ISO format. But if you switch to the UK version of English, there's that format right there. And so you can hit OK, and you get the same thing. So that's two different ways that you can apply the proper format. And so I'm going to go ahead and select the entire column, and I'm going to go to number formats, date. The locale is UK, change to the proper format, and there we have it. And so now all I have to do is save this as a CSV file, which we can read into R, and it should guess properly, or it should treat this as the proper type of variable now that we have the proper formatting. Okay, so now we see how to apply the proper formatting in Excel. There is a problem here, in that you have to do that every time you have dates. There's really no good way to set up the default. You can go and change the default settings in the Windows control panel, but I messed with that. It didn't seem to work. Um, so a potential solution is that you just change the format every time you need to import into R. So those steps that I just showed you, you just do that every time. That's not too big of a deal. Another thing you can do is change the format, then save that sheet as a template for future spreadsheets. That is another potential way that you could try to make this a little bit easier. But really, it's not that big of a deal, and it's one of those things you just have to learn how to do if you're going to import your data into R. Okay, so now we have the formatting correct in Excel, and we've saved it as a comma delimited file, which we're going to import into R. So we've got half the battle won. Now, when we read those dates in, R is going to treat them as a factor type of variable or a factor type of vector. Okay, so when R reads in the data from Excel, it guesses at what type of data it is. So if it's all just numbers or if it's all integers, it will treat it as an integer type. Or if it's all text, it'll treat it as a character or a string type. There is a date type of variable, but R is not going to read it in. It's not going to read your dates in as a date type automatically. It's going to read it in as a factor type, which is kind of like a text type that has several different levels. Anyway, when R reads this in as a factor type, then we're going to have to convert it to a date type, and then we'll be able to work with it properly as a date. Now you'll remember that earlier this didn't work. When we converted a factor to a date, it was a mess. But that's because the formatting was wrong in Excel. Now that the formatting is correct, this should work. So let's go ahead and see how we import the data as a factor and then convert it to a date. So we fixed the formatting in Excel. We saved it as a CSV. Let's go ahead and load it into R and see how it works. So I'm going to call this just Z is going to be the name of our data frame now. And I'm going to use read CSV, and then I'm going to say file choose, so I can go choose the proper file. And this is the CSV I created. All right, and let's look at the first few lines of Z. So I'm going to go head of Z. So that tells me just show me the first few lines in that data frame. And here you see that the first 5 rows of data from that Excel spreadsheet. And the important thing is to look here at sample date, and you see that it is in the year, month, day format that we fixed in Excel. Now, let's find out what kind of vector that is. So I'm going to go class Z $ sample date. Again, go to the data frame named Z, which is what we just read in, find the vector named sample date, and tell me what type of vector that is. And it's a factor, which is what we had before, right? And so you say, well, we haven't gained anything, but we have gained something. It's still reading it as a factor, but now let's go ahead and make a new vector where we change this to a date. So now we're going to say Z $ new date equals as capital D date Z $ sample date. Again, go to the data frame that's named Z, find the vector called sample date. Convert that to the date, convert every value in that vector to the date type and store it in a new variable that's called new date, which is also going to be in the same data frame. So now let's go ahead and up arrow and get head Z again. And here you see is the new vector we created called new date, which is converting sample date from a factor type to a date type. But now look what happened. Now it's correct. When we did this before, we converted it to a date and the dates were a mess. Now we convert it to a date type and the dates stay the same. And that's because we started with the correct format. That's the point. Okay, well, that worked, and that's a fine way of doing things. However, it is possible to have R import those data directly as the date variable type. And so in the long run, this may save you a step or two, and this may be the way to go. What we're going to do is use an argument called the call classes, the column classes argument, when we read in the CSV file. And if we do the syntax correctly, when R reads in that date data, it will automatically treat it as the date variable type in R, and that's what we want. Okay, now we're going to import the data, and we're going to take those dates and put them straight into a vector that's the date class without having this extra step. So I'm going to re-import the data. I'm going to call this new data frame Z2. I'm going to read a CSV file, and I'm going to file choose which one it is. But now I'm going to add an argument to this statement that is call classes equals, and then I need to make a list, but there's really only one thing in the list, so I'm going to go C, and now I'm going to tell it which classes for which variables. And so I'm going to say sample date is going to be the date type. So I have to know which column contains my dates, which you should know that. And I could add more of these if there were different columns that I wanted to specify the class, but again, R is pretty good at guessing the class for everything that's not a date. So the only thing I'm going to do is tell it to make sure that sample date is the date class, and that should be it. So if we look at this statement, it's still just read in the CSV, it's still just go choose the file from the menu. But now, when you read it in, there should be a vector called sample date, and you want to read, R needs to read that in as the date type, not the factor type, which is what it did before. So let's return. Here's the file. Let's check out the first part of it. So head of Z2, and you see my data. And now let's see what is the type or the class of that sample date. So class Z2 $ sample date, and you see it's the date type. So that's how we get it directly into the date type without having to convert it. Okay, and that's it. So in conclusion, remember how we did this. We first started with the proper format in Excel, and that took a few steps, but ultimately you can make that the default format. Then when you read the data into R, you need to pay attention to the class or the type of variable that R puts your date data into, and you need to make sure that that is treated as date data. And the dates and the date class affect how R treats the data. So for example, when you do graphing, if the data are treated as a date, they'll graph one way, but if they're treated as a factor, they'll graph a different way. And you need to understand that if you're going to understand how to use R. And so if you're ever working with date data and it's not behaving the way you want, go back and look at what the class of the variable is, or the class of the vector is, and that often can be changed, and then that can solve your problem. So that's all I have. Let me know if you got any questions, and I'll see you later.